At the end of the 16th century, the mentally ill in England existed in conditions that are difficult to describe without shuddering. They were locked in prisons alongside thieves and murderers, kept in workhouses among beggars and vagrants, and chained in the damp basements of private homes. In the cellars of some poorhouses, the mentally ill were kept in cages like wild beasts. They were fed through iron bars, and visitors could pay a penny to come and look at the madmen, as if they were curious animals in a menagerie. 16th century society saw no difference between a criminal and a madman, or between a beggar and the mentally ill. They were all outcasts who needed to be hidden from the eyes of respectable citizens. Families with sufficient means locked their insane relatives in attic rooms or sent them to private madhouses, where conditions were rarely better than those in prison. The poor, meanwhile, ended up in workhouses, where they were kept in filth and cold, often chained to walls. In 1792, an event occurred that shook the conscience of English society. A Quaker named William Tuke, from the city of York, learned of the death of an acquaintance in a local hospital asylum. The circumstances of her death were unclear, and her relatives had not been allowed to see her before she passed. Tuke decided to investigate the conditions of the mentally ill and was shocked by what he found. Patients were held in chains, shackled to walls in dark, cold, and filthy rooms. They were fed meager food, were not given clean clothes, and were never allowed out into the fresh air. Staff could beat patients with impunity, using whips and sticks to maintain order. No treatment was provided. The only goal was to keep these people under lock and key, far away from society. William Tuke, driven by Quaker principles of compassion and a belief in the dignity of every human being, decided to create something entirely different. In 1796, he called upon the Quaker community to establish an institution that was named the York Retreat. His idea was radical. The mentally ill should not be prisoners, but guests who are treated with dignity and respect. In this facility, there would be no chains, no shackles, and no physical punishments. Construction began in 1796, and in 1797, the retreat received its first patient. The building was located outside the city, surrounded by gardens and fields. It was designed to accommodate about 30 people, creating the atmosphere of a large family rather than a prison. The rooms were bright and clean, with windows looking out onto green lawns. Patients wore ordinary clothes rather than prison garb. They slept on real beds with sheets and blankets. The treatment was based on what the Tukes called a moral approach. Its essence lay in personal attention, benevolence, and the restoration of the patient's self-respect. It was expected that they would dine at a table like an ordinary family, engage in polite conversation over tea, and perform simple household chores. The role of the superintendent and his assistants was to encourage rational behavior through patience and kindness, rather than the stick and chain. William Tuke and his son Samuel believed that madness could be cured if the sick were treated as people who had temporarily lost their reason but were capable of regaining it. The system was based on rules and constant observation, supported by simple rewards for good behavior and mild punishments for bad. Physical restraints could be applied in extreme cases, but only moderately and never out of cruelty. Patients were not kept all together in one large ward, as was common in the old asylum. The Tukes tried to adapt treatment for each individual, placing those with similar conditions together. Quiet melancholics lived separately from violent maniacs, women were separated from men, and those recovering were kept away from those in acute state. Recreation was considered an important part of healing. Patients could walk in the gardens, tend to flowers, play simple games, and read books from a small library. On warm days, tea parties were held on the lawn. On winter evenings, patients gathered by the fireplace in the common room. The superintendent and his wife lived in the same building, creating the atmosphere of a family home. By 1810, the fame of the York Retreat had spread across England. Visitors came to see this unusual establishment where the mad were treated with kindness instead of chains. Many remained skeptical, wondering how dangerous madmen could be managed without physical coercion. But the results spoke for themselves. many patients recovered and returned to society. The ideas of the Tukes slowly began to penetrate the consciousness of the educated class in England. Philosophers and doctors began to discuss a new approach to mental illness. Gradually, the conviction formed that madness was not a divine punishment or an incurable vice, but a medical condition that could and should be treated. This was a slow but steady shift in public consciousness that paved the way for the revolution in psychiatric care that would unfold in the 19th century. In 1832, the Hanwell Asylum opened on the outskirts of London, and this event became a turning point in the history of psychiatric care in England. It was one of the first large state institutions built specifically for the mentally ill poor. Middlesex County spent significant funds on the construction of a majestic building that could house several hundred patients. The architecture of the Hanwell Asylum was striking. It was built of red brick, with a portico and columns in a classical style, featuring a dome over the central administrative block. From the center, long wings stretched out in both directions with wards for patients, one for men and one for women. High windows let in plenty of light. Wide corridors allowed patients to stroll during bad weather. Around the building stretched vast gardens and fields where patients could work and breathe fresh air. The first superintendent of Hanwell was Dr. William Charles Ellis, a man of firm conviction. He believed that work and religion together could heal the mentally ill. The entire complex functioned as a large farm. Patients grew vegetables, cared for livestock, and worked in laundries and kitchens. The men repaired buildings and roads. The women sewed clothes, washed laundry, and cooked food for the entire institution. It is important to understand that patients were not paid for their labor. Their work was not viewed as exploitation, but as part of the treatment. Doctors of that time were convinced that idleness was harmful to a sick mind, while structured activity helped restore order to one's thought. A patient engaged in useful labor felt needed, and this feeling was important for their healing. In 1839, an event occurred at Hanwell that would change the approach to treating the mentally ill throughout the entire country. The new superintendent, Dr. John Conolly, began to implement a system of complete abandonment of physical restraints. Until this moment, the use of straitjackets, binding to beds, iron handcuffs, and shackles had been common practice even in the best asylum. Conolly believed that physical restraint humiliated human dignity and hindered recovery. He began to gradually release patients from straitjackets, chains, and other means of control. The asylum staff was horrified. How could one manage hundreds of violent madmen without these tools of control? But Conolly was adamant. Instead of physical restraint, he introduced a strict system of observation and management. The number of attendants and nurses was increased. They were trained in methods of calming excited patients through words and presence, rather than force. For the most unmanageable patients, the last resort was isolation in special padded cells. These rooms were lined with leather or canvas cushions filled with horsehair so that the patient could not cause themselves harm. The therapeutic rationale for isolation was to remove the patient from the cause of their excitement and limit external stimulation until they calmed down. The room was quiet, dim, and empty. The patient remained there from a few hours to several days, depending on the severity of their condition. Many doctors of the time believed that such isolation was more humane than a straitjacket, although a modern perspective might be different. By 1845, the success of Hanwell was obvious. The Metropolitan Commissioners who inspected the asylum found that isolation had a very powerful effect in calming those who were in a state of temporary excitement. Physical restraints gradually fell out of use in state asylums across the country. It was a quiet revolution that changed the very nature of psychiatric care. The same year, 1845, became a turning point for another reason. Parliament passed the County Asylums Act, also known as the Lunacy Act. This law required counties throughout England and Wales to provide asylums for people with mental disorders. The era when the mentally ill were kept in prisons and workhouses was meant to end. Parliament allocated significant funds for the construction of new asylums. Across the country, the design and erection of large institutions began. Architects received detailed instruction. Buildings were to be majestic but not threatening, spacious and bright, and surrounded by gardens and fields. Each asylum was to become a model of modern science and philanthropy. In 1850, there were only 12,000 beds in mental asylums in England and Wales. This was clearly insufficient for the needs of the population. Thousands of mentally ill people were still kept in workhouses under terrible conditions. The 1845 Act launched an unprecedented construction program that would change the landscape of psychiatric care. Between 1845 and 1860, dozens of new asylums sprang up across England. Each county rushed to build its own institution, striving to surpass its neighbors in grandeur and modernity. These were huge buildings capable of accommodating from 300 to 1,000 patients each. The architecture of these asylums followed certain principles. The most common was a corridor layout. The administrative block was in the center. From it, in both directions, stretched long wings with wards. The male and female wards were completely separated. Within each ward, patients were sorted by state of condition, the quiet and recovering in one ward, the violent and excited in others. Long corridors were not just passageways, but places for walking in bad weather. They had large windows through which light poured. The walls were painted in light tones. At the end of each corridor was a day room with a fireplace where patients could gather in the evenings. Sleeping wards held from 20 to 40 people. Beds stood in even rows at a distance of 2 feet and 6 inches from each other. The design of toilets and washrooms required special attention. They had to be large enough for simultaneous use by many patients, but at the same time safe. Mirrors were made of polished metal rather than glass so that patients could not break them and use shards for self-injury. Faucets were recessed into the walls. Door handles had a rounded shape without sharp edges. Vast grounds were created around the buildings. High stone walls surrounded the asylums, not to make them look like prisons, but to designate the boundary between the internal therapeutic space and the outside world. Inside the walls, gardens were planted with flower beds, walkways for strolls, and lawns for games. For men, there were cricket and croquet grounds. For women, arbors and benches in shady corners. A mandatory part of each asylum was a farm. The farms grew vegetables and kept cows for milk, pigs, and chickens. This provided the asylum with fresh products and, more importantly, gave patients work. Men labored in the fields, in the gardens, and in the barns. Women tended to dairy cows, gathered eggs, and worked in the garden. In 1850, the Colney Hatch Asylum was built in Middlesex, which became one of the largest in Europe. It could accommodate more than 2,000 patients. The building stretched a third of a mile in length. Its main facade, with towers and a portico, made an impressive sight. Local residents called it a palace. It looked so majestic. But behind the magnificent facades hid practical problems. Managing an institution for 2,000 people turned out to be incredibly difficult. It required hundreds of attendants, nurses, doctors, cooks, laundresses, and gardeners. Maintaining such a huge institution required constant funding, which was often lacking. In 1853, Parliament passed a new law on mental asylums, which established strict rules for patient admission. These measures were introduced to protect people from unlawful detention. For the detention of indigent mentally ill people to be legal, a medical certificate signed by a doctor or apothecary who had personally examined the patient within the previous 7 days was required. Furthermore, an order from a magistrate, clergyman, workhouse master, or guardian was needed. By the late 1850s, the asylum system in England was already well developed. More than 50 large state institutions were accepting tens of thousands of patients. Small private madhouses, where wealthy families could keep their insane relatives, began to close. They could not compete with large state asylums that offered more modern conditions and better medical supervision. In the 1860s, Life in a Victorian asylum was strictly regulated. Every day followed the same schedule, from which there were no deviations. This was considered an important element of treatment. Order and predictability were supposed to restore order to the patient's minds. The morning began at 6. Attendants unlocked the doors to the sleeping wards and woke the patients. Men and women washed with cold water from copper basins that stood on long wooden tables in the washrooms. Towels made of coarse canvas hung on hooks along the wall. Attendants examined each patient, checking the condition of their skin for rashes or wounds. After washing, the patients were combed. Women had their hair braided or tied in buns. Men had their hair and beards trimmed short. Clothing was uniform. Men wore gray or brown canvas trousers and shirts. Women wore long dresses of the same coarse material and white caps. In winter, woolen vests and shawls were provided. At 7 a.m., a bell rang for breakfast. Patients went in formation to the dining hall, a large room with long wooden tables and benches. Breakfast consisted of porridge boiled in water, a piece of bread with butter, and a mug of tea. Bread was baked in the asylum's own bakery from whole grain flour. The butter was spread in a thin layer on the bread. No sugar was put in the tea. Patients ate in silence under the supervision of attendants. Conversations at the table were not encouraged. The tableware was tin, with no knives, only spoons. After breakfast, patients washed their bowls and spoons in large vats of water. This, too, was considered part of the treatment, accustoming them to order and self-service. From 8 to 9 a.m., the wards were cleaned. Those patients who were capable of working were sent to the exercise yards and garden. Attendants and recovering patients scrubbed floors, dusted, and aired out the room. Bedding was changed every 2 weeks. Straw mattresses were fluffed and taken outside for fresh air. From 9 a.m., the workday began. Patients were assigned to various jobs depending on their ability and condition. Men worked in the vegetable gardens, on the farm, or in the workshops. Some dug garden beds, others cared for livestock, and others repaired tools or furniture. Women engaged in sewing, laundry, and food preparation. In the large laundry, there were huge vats of boiling water where linen was washed for the entire asylum. Women washed, rinsed, wrung out heavy wet laundry, and hung it on lines in the yard. Work continued until noon. Then followed the main meal of the day. Dinner was served at 1 o'clock. It consisted of boiled meat, potatoes, and vegetables. The meat was tough and stringy. Often it was beef or mutton of poor quality. Potatoes were boiled in their skins. Vegetables were simple: cabbage, turnip, carrots. On Sundays, a little gravy was added to the dinner. After dinner, patients were given an hour of rest. Those who could read were allowed into a small library, where the shelves held tattered books of a religious nature and several volumes with descriptions of travels. Most simply sat in the day rooms, staring out the windows or dozing in chairs. From 3 to 6 p.m., work resumed. Those patients who were not suitable for work spent this time in the exercise yards or in the day room. Attendants encouraged them to at least move a little, rather than sit idle. It was believed that idleness was harmful to a sick mind. At 6 p.m., supper was served. It consisted of bread with butter and tea. Sometimes a piece of cheese or a little porridge was added. After supper, it was time for evening entertainment. But this did not happen every day. Twice a week, dances were organized in the asylum. In the large hall, patients of both sexes gathered. Although they were not allowed to dance together, men danced with men, women with women, accompanied by a small orchestra of recovering patients. They played simple tunes on fiddles, flutes, and drums. On Wednesdays, the asylum chaplain conducted evening prayer. Patients gathered in the chapel, a small room with wooden benches and a simple wooden cross on the wall. The chaplain read passages from the Bible and delivered sermons about patience, humility, and the hope for redemption. Singing psalms was considered beneficial for mental health. On Saturdays, those patients who were scheduled were bathed. The large bathroom had several copper tubs set in a row. Water was heated in the boiler room and supplied through pipes. Patients were bathed quickly and without ceremony. Attendants ensured they were washed thoroughly. By 8 p.m., it was time for sleep. Patients were led to the sleeping wards, where they lay down on their narrow beds with straw mattresses. Attendants extinguished the gas lamps, leaving only one lantern lit at the end of the corridor. Some patients deemed prone to suicide or violence were watched all night. The night shift of attendants walked the corridors, peering into the wards through small windows in the doors. Day after day, week after week, month after month, this routine continued. For some patients, this monotonous routine lasted for years. Visits from relatives were rare. They were allowed only on Sundays for 1 hour. Many patients never received visitors. Their families forgot about them or were ashamed of them. In the 1870s, Victorian doctors were convinced that water possessed powerful healing properties. Hydrotherapy became one of the main methods of treating mental illness. In every large asylum, special rooms were built for water procedures. The theory underlying hydrotherapy was simple. Water of varying temperatures applied to the skin triggers reactions throughout the body, including the brain and nervous system. Warm water calms and relaxes. Cold water stimulates and tones. Doctors believe that the correct application of water could heal the most severe forms of madness. Continuous baths were the most common form of hydrotherapy. The patient was placed in a tub with warm water at a temperature between 92 and 97 degrees Fahrenheit. The tub had a special design. A canvas cover with a hole for the head was stretched over it so that the patient could not get out. They could lie in the water for hours, sometimes all day, and in special cases, all night. The room for continuous baths was quiet and dim. The windows were covered with thick curtains so there was no bright light. Sounds from outside did not penetrate inside. The patient lay in warm water in the twilight and silence, deprived of any external stimulation. An attendant sat nearby, ensuring the water temperature remained constant, occasionally adding hot water from a bucket. For excited and violent patients, such treatment often proved effective. After several hours in the bath, they indeed calmed down, becoming lethargic and compliant. Doctors considered this a sign of healing, not realizing that the patients were simply exhausted from their long stay in the water. Some fell asleep right in the bath. Their heads were supported by special headrests. For patients with melancholy who were apathetic and motionless, cold showers were used. The patient was placed under a strong jet of cold water that crashed down on them from above. The shock from the cold water was supposed to awaken dormant vital forces and stimulate the nervous system. The procedure lasted from a few minutes to half an hour. Patients feared cold showers. Icy water caused painful sensations. The strong pressure of the jet pounded their head and shoulders. After the shower, the patient was rubbed with a rough towel and dressed in dry clothes. They shivered from cold and fatigue. Doctors watched to see if they had become more lively and responsive after the procedure. Wraps were another form of hydrotherapy. Sheets were soaked in cold or hot water and tightly wrapped around the patient's body from neck to feet. Over these, they were wrapped in dry blankets. The patient lay motionless for several hours while the sheets dried on their body. It was believed that this drew the illness out of the body through the skin. Hot wraps caused profuse sweating. The patient lay wet with sweat, their body burning. Cold wraps, on the contrary, first caused shivering, but then the body warmed the damp sheets with its own heat. After the procedure, the patient was washed with warm water and put to bed. Nurses and attendants had to carefully watch the patients during hydrotherapeutic procedures. Accidents occurred. Patients lost consciousness from heat or cold. Some choked in the baths if the canvas cover slipped. Attendants had to be always on guard, ready to quickly extract the patient from the tub or terminate the procedure. Besides water, doctors used various medications, and opiates were the most common means for calming excited patients. A tincture of opium, known as laudanum, was given in large doses. The patient plunged into a deep sleep that could last many hours. Doctors believed that such rest was beneficial for a sick brain. Bromides were also widely used. Potassium bromide was dissolved in water and given to patients to drink 3 times a day. This substance caused drowsiness and apathy. Patients who received bromides over a long period became lethargic. Their skin took on a grayish tint, and rashes appeared. But doctors continued to prescribe these drugs, believing they prevented bouts of excitement. Chloral was another popular sedative. It was given at night to patients suffering from insomnia. Chloral caused deep sleep but had an unpleasant taste and irritated the stomach. Patients complained of nausea and abdominal pain after taking chloral. All these treatment methods were based on the limited medical knowledge of that time. Victorian doctors did not understand the true nature of most mental illnesses. They acted by trial and error, observing patient reactions and trying to find what helped. Many of their methods were useless or even harmful, but they reflected genuine attempts to help suffering people. In the 1870s, Victorian doctors classified mental illnesses into several main categories. The vast majority of patients received diagnoses of mania, melancholy, or dementia. Accompanying each diagnosis was a record of the alleged cause of the illness. Mania was a diagnosis for anyone who displayed excitement and violence. Such patients shouted, sang songs at inappropriate times, tore their clothes, and attacked others. They could not sleep, refused to eat, and were in constant motion. Their eyes burned with a feverish glint, and their faces were flushed from strain. The causes of mania, according to Victorian doctors, were diverse. Religious excitement was considered a frequent cause. A person overly preoccupied with religion, attending too many church services, or reading the Bible day and night could fall into mania. Financial losses also led to mania. Bankruptcy, loss of property, and business failures upset the mind. Alcohol was another common cause. Chronic drunkards were often admitted to asylums in a state of delirium tremens. Melancholy was the opposite of mania. Patients with melancholy were immersed in deep sadness. They sat motionless for hours, staring at one point, and did not answer questions. They refused food, believing they were unworthy of eating or that the food was poisoned. Many expressed a desire to die and attempted suicide at the first opportunity. Various misfortunes were considered causes of melancholy. The death of a loved one, especially a child, often led to melancholy. Women after childbirth were especially vulnerable. Postpartum melancholy was well known to Victorian doctors. Poverty and need were also viewed as causes. Constant anxiety about daily bread could break the mind. Dementia in the Victorian understanding encompassed any form of mental decline. This could be elderly people who had lost their memory and reason. It could be middle-aged people whose minds were fading without a visible cause. It could be patients who had long suffered from mania or melancholy and finally fell into a state of total mental emptiness. Patients with dementia were the most helpless inhabitants of asylum. They could not care for themselves. They had to be fed, dressed, and washed. They did not recognize relatives and did not remember their own name. Some fell into childhood, playing with dolls or toys, and babbled nonsensical words. For them, there was no hope of recovery. They spent the rest of their days in asylum. Hysteria was a diagnosis that was applied almost exclusively to women. Victorian doctors believed that the female nature made them especially vulnerable to nervous disorder. Women were more emotional and sensitive, and their nervous systems were more fragile than those of men. Hysterical women exhibited strange symptoms. They could suddenly lose the ability to walk or speak without a visible physical cause. They suffered from convulsions and fainting spells. They cried for no reason or, conversely, laughed at inappropriate times. Their behavior was unpredictable and disturbing. The causes of hysteria were linked to the female reproductive system. It was believed that the uterus influenced a woman's nervous system. Irregular periods, difficulties with conception, problems during pregnancy, all this could cause hysteria. It was also believed that suppressed sexual desire or excessive sexual activity could lead to this state. Treatment of hysteria was aimed at forcing a woman to accept her nature and role. Doctors told hysterical women that they must be submissive and obedient. They were forbidden to read novels or visit theaters, as such entertainment was considered overly stimulating. They were encouraged to engage in quiet domestic tasks, sewing, embroidery, knitting. Moral insanity was another Victorian diagnosis. This term was applied to people whose behavior was immoral or antisocial, but who did not exhibit clear signs of madness. Thieves or people with unusual sexual preferences could be diagnosed with moral insanity. Rebellious wives sometimes ended up in asylums with this diagnosis. A husband could claim that his wife suffered from moral insanity if she refused to obey him, spent money without his permission, or expressed a desire to live independently. With medical certificates from 2 doctors and an order from a magistrate, such a woman could be placed in an asylum. Epilepsy also brought people to asylums, although it was a neurological, not a psychiatric, disease. Victorians did not understand the distinction between diseases of the brain and mental illnesses. People suffering from seizures frightened others with their convulsions and loss of consciousness. Their families sent them to asylums, not knowing what else to do with them. By the end of the 1870s, asylums were filled with people with the most varied conditions. Some truly suffered from severe mental illnesses. Others had neurological problems that Victorian medicine could not correctly diagnose. Still, others simply did not conform to social norms and were isolated from society under the guise of madness. They all lived together behind the high walls of asylums, united by the common fate of outcasts. By the 1880s, the Victorian asylum system began to face serious problems. The main one was overcrowding. When the 1845 Act required counties to build asylums, no one foresaw how many people would end up in them. The number of patients grew year by year. In 1850, there were 12,000 mentally ill people in English asylums. By 1880, there were already more than 70,000. Asylums built for 300 or 500 people now held twice as many. Why were so many people in asylum? In part, it was because society had become more ready to recognize mental illness and seek help. Previously, families kept insane relatives at home, hiding them from the outside world. Now, there was a system where they could be placed. But also, many people ended up in asylums not so much because of mental illness as because of poverty and social problems. Elderly people who had no one to look after them, alcoholics, the homeless, all of them could end up in asylum. Workhouses were overcrowded and gladly sent their most difficult inhabitants to asylums. Instead of building new asylums, counties often simply added wings and buildings to existing institutions. An asylum built as a single architectural whole turned into a chaotic pile of structures from different eras. To the majestic central building, cheap barracks were added, where patients were housed in cramped conditions. Staffing was catastrophically short. One attendant could be responsible for 50 or more patients. In such conditions, the individual attention that the founders of moral treatment spoke of was impossible. Attendants and nurses performed only the most basic functions: feeding, dressing, and maintaining order. Many attendants were poorly trained and received miserable pay. The work was hard and thankless. One had to manage violent patients, wash those who could not care for themselves, and clean up filth and waste. Staff turnover was high. Experienced workers left, replaced by newcomers who did not know how to handle the mentally ill. In such conditions, cruelty became almost inevitable. Tired, overworked attendants lost their patience. They might strike a patient who did not obey or push someone who moved too slowly. Official policy against physical abuse existed, but in practice, it was difficult to monitor. Food deteriorated as the number of patients grew. Asylum budgets were limited, and administrators looked for ways to save money. Meat became even tougher and rarer. Bread was often stale, and vegetables were wilted. Patients complained of hunger, but their complaints rarely led to changes. Sanitary conditions also worsened. Toilets and washrooms intended for a certain number of patients were now used by twice as many people. They were dirty and smelled bad. Water for washing was often cold and dirty. Bedding was changed less frequently. Straw mattresses were infested with bugs and lice. In 1890, Parliament passed a new law on the mentally ill, attempting to correct some of the problems. The law tightened requirements for patient admission and strengthened asylum inspection. Commissioners received more authority to check conditions and the treatment of patients. Inspections did reveal problems. Commissioners discovered overcrowded wards and a lack of staff in cases of abuse. They wrote reports demanding improvements, but funding remained insufficient, and many recommendations were not implemented. Asylum doctors were increasingly disillusioned with the possibilities of treatment. In the early years of the Victorian era, there was optimism. It was believed that most mental illnesses could be cured with the right approach. Now, this optimism was fading. Doctors saw that most of their patients did not recover but spent years or decades in asylum. By the late 1880s, many doctors had concluded that severe mental illnesses were hereditary and incurable. This pessimistic theory explained why so few patients recovered. If the illness is passed on by heredity in the very nature of the person, then medicine can do little. This pessimism changed the character of the asylum. They were viewed less and less as treatment institutions and more as places for housing the chronically ill. The goal was not to heal, but simply to provide food, shelter, and minimal care. Asylums were turning into warehouses for those whom society had abandoned. Nevertheless, some patients still recovered and were discharged. Those who suffered from acute mania or melancholy caused by temporary stressors had a chance of recovery. After a few months of rest, regular meals, and the absence of external stressors, they could return to society. But for the majority, the asylum became their last home. They died there, sometimes decades after admission. They were buried in the asylum cemetery, often in unmarked graves or with simple wooden crosses on which only numbers were carved. Families did not come to the funerals. No one mourned them. In 1892, the English public was shocked by a series of articles in newspapers exposing the conditions in some asylum. Journalists, having gained access to the institutions, described scenes that shocked readers. Although similar exposures had happened before, now they received wide publicity. In one asylum, a journalist found patients sitting motionless on wooden benches in a cold corridor. They sat like that for hours. They were not allowed to move or speak. An attendant walked back and forth with a stick, hitting those who moved. The patients were dressed in rags. Their faces were dirty, their hair disheveled. In another institution, it was discovered that patients were fed rotten meat and moldy bread. Drinking water was taken from a contaminated well and caused intestinal disorder. Sick patients lay on dirty mattresses without proper care. Sanitary conditions were so terrible that an inspector wrote in his report, "This place looks more like a medieval prison than a modern medical institution." Parliament was forced to respond to public outrage. A special investigation into asylum conditions across the country was appointed. The commission visited dozens of institutions and interviewed hundreds of patients and staff members. The results of the investigation showed that problems were widespread, although not equally severe everywhere. In 1895, Parliament allocated additional funding for improving conditions in asylums. Counties were ordered to increase the number of staff, improve patient nutrition, and repair dilapidated buildings. The lunacy commissioners were granted more powers to conduct surprise inspections and punish administrators who allowed abuse. Some improvements did indeed occur. In the most problematic asylums, cruel attendants were fired, and new workers were hired. Food began to be purchased from more reliable suppliers. New laundries and washrooms were built. In some asylums, additional wards were opened to reduce crowding. However, the fundamental problem remained unresolved. The number of patients continued to grow. By 1900, there were about 100,000 people in English and Welsh asylums. The system created with good intentions in the 1840s was now bursting at the seams under the weight of its own success. Doctors and administrators looked for new approaches to treatment. In some asylums, more attention began to be paid to the leisure of patients. Orchestras made up of patients were created, which gave concerts in the evening. Theatrical performances were organized where patients played simple roles. In the summer months, picnics were held on the asylum ground. Sports also began to be viewed as a therapeutic tool. Men played cricket and football on the asylum lawns. Women were allowed to play croquet and badminton. It was believed that physical exercise in the fresh air was beneficial for both body and mind. In 1897, when Queen Victoria celebrated the Diamond Jubilee of her reign, festivals were held in asylums across the country. Patients were given extra food. Flags and garlands were hung in the dining halls. In the evening, fireworks were set off. For many patients, this was a rare moment of joy in their monotonous life. Some progressive asylums began experimenting with new architectural solutions. Instead of huge buildings housing hundreds of patients, small cottages were built on the asylum grounds. Each cottage was intended for 20 to 30 people and had its own living room, dining room, and bedrooms. This created a more home-like atmosphere. The idea of agricultural colonies also gained popularity. Patients lived in small farming settlements and worked in the fields under minimal supervision. It was believed that such a life, close to nature and removed from the stress of urban civilization, promoted healing. However, these experiments remained a rarity. Most asylums continued to function on the old model. Huge buildings, overcrowded with patients, a lack of staff, and meager budgets. The reforms of the 1890s brought some improvements but did not change the very nature of the system. By the end of the Victorian era, in 1900 and 1901, when Queen Victoria died, the asylum system was in a state of crisis. The optimism of the mid-19th century, when society believed that mental illnesses could be cured, had completely evaporated. It was replaced by grim realism. Asylums were places for housing the incurably ill, isolated from society. The 20th century began without much hope for the inhabitants of English asylum. The Edwardian era, named after King Edward VII, who ruled from 1901 to 1910, did not bring significant changes to the psychiatric system. The number of patients continued to grow. By 1910, there were about 120,000 people in the asylums of England and Wales. Construction of new institutions continued, but they filled up almost faster than they were open. Medicine at the beginning of the 20th century had little to offer the mentally ill. Treatment methods remained practically the same as in the Victorian era: hydrotherapy, sedative drugs, work, and routine. Some doctors experimented with new approaches, but without much success. One of the new theories was the doctrine of degeneration. According to this theory, mental illnesses are passed on by heredity, and with each generation, they become more severe. A family that had one alcoholic would, in the next generation, produce a lunatic, and in the next, an idiot. This grim theory led to the appearance of the eugenics movement, which called for preventing the reproduction of the mentally ill. Some asylums began performing sterilizations on patients, although this was not as widely legalized in England as in some other countries. The idea was that if the mentally ill did not have children, then eventually mental illnesses would disappear from society. This idea, so monstrous from a modern point of view, seemed reasonable to many educated people at the beginning of the 20th century. The First World War, which began in 1914, significantly affected the asylum. Many attendants and nurses were called up to the army or went to work in military hospitals. Staff were already in short supply. Now, the situation became critical. Elderly people, women, and men unfit for military service made up the backbone of the remaining staff. Food supplies also worsened. The war caused shortages of many products, and asylums, always at the end of the line for distribution, suffered more than others. Patients starved, feeding on watery soups and stale bread. Mortality in asylums increased. After the end of the war in 1918, new patients began arriving in asylums, soldiers whose minds had been broken by the war. Shell shock, as it was then called, what would later be known as post-traumatic stress disorder, brought thousands of young men into psychiatric institutions. They woke up at night screaming, saw nightmares in the daylight, and could not return to normal life. The 1920s brought some improvements. The economy recovered after the war. Funding for asylums increased slightly. New attendants and nurses were hired. Nutrition improved. but the fundamental structure of the system remained unchanged. In 1930, there were more than 130,000 patients in English asylums, which were now increasingly called psychiatric hospitals. The average length of stay was years, often decades. Many patients were admitted young and died as old men, having spent their entire adult lives behind the asylum wall. Daily life in asylums in the 1930s differed little from Victorian times. The same early rising, the same long corridors and overcrowded wards, the same monotonous work, the same meager dinners. Technical progress in the 20th century had little effect on these institutions. In some asylums, electric lighting appeared instead of gas lamps, central heating instead of stoves. But these were superficial changes. Entertainment became more varied. Radio receivers appeared. Patients could listen to BBC broadcasts. Motion pictures were shown in specially equipped halls. But for the majority of patients, life remained gray and hopeless. Treatment methods began to change in the 1930s. New, more radical approaches appeared. Insulin shock therapy, introduced by an Austrian doctor, began to be used in English asylums. The patient was injected with large doses of insulin, causing a hypoglycemic coma. After a series of such procedures, some patients showed improvement. Electroconvulsive therapy appeared in the late 1930s. An electric current was passed through the patient's brain, causing a convulsive seizure. This was a frightening sight. The patient beat convulsively on the bed, foam coming from their mouth. After the procedure, they did not remember what had happened to them. But for some patients, especially those suffering from severe melancholy, it helped. Lobotomy, a surgical operation on the brain, began to be used in England from the late 1930s. A Portuguese doctor developed a procedure in which the connections between the frontal lobes of the brain and the rest of its parts were severed. This calmed violent patients but often turned them into listless, apathetic people. Nevertheless, many doctors saw this as progress. A calm, apathetic patient was preferable to a violent one. The Second World War, which began in 1939, again hit the asylums hard. Staff were called to the front or evacuated along with the civilian population. Some asylums were requisitioned for military needs. Their patients were transferred to other overcrowded institutions. Supplies of food and medicine were difficult. During the war, more patients died in asylums than usual. Hunger, cold, and disease took the lives of those who were most vulnerable. The exact number of victims was never calculated. These deaths went unnoticed in the general chaos of the war. After the war ended in 1945, England was a ruined and impoverished country. The asylums were in a terrible state. Dilapidated buildings, a lack of everything necessary, and demoralized staff. But the coming changes were to alter the entire system of psychiatric care. In 1948, the National Health Service was created in Great Britain. This was a revolutionary step. Medical care became free for all citizens. Psychiatric hospitals, as the former asylums were now officially called, became part of the new system. The first years after the creation of the health service brought some improvement. Funding was allocated for building repairs, new equipment was purchased, and staff salaries were raised. But the system itself remained unchanged. Huge, isolated institutions, overcrowded with long-term patients. In the early 1950s, there were about 150,000 patients in the psychiatric hospitals of England and Wales. This was a peak, after which a slow, and then faster, decline began. The era that began in the late 16th century with the noble ideas of William Tuke was coming to an end. The revolution began not with social reforms, but with medicine. In 1952, chlorpromazine, the first true antipsychotic drug, was synthesized in France. Under the trade name Largactil, it began to be used in English hospitals. For the first time, doctors had a tool that truly helped control the symptoms of severe mental illnesses. Patients who for years had been excited and violent calmed down after taking chlorpromazine. Hallucinations and delusions became less intense. Many patients who were considered hopeless began to show improvement. Hydrotherapy, which required a lot of time and staff, was no longer needed. A simple pill could do what once took hours of water procedures. In subsequent years, other psychotropic drugs appeared: antidepressants, tranquilizers, mood stabilizers. Psychopharmacology changed the face of psychiatry. For the first time in history, medicine could offer real help to many mentally ill people. This had far-reaching consequences. If patients could be treated with medication, why keep them for years in large, isolated institutions? The idea of treatment in the community arose. Patients could live at home or in small group homes, take medication, and periodically visit a doctor. In 1962, Minister of Health Enoch Powell delivered a speech that became a turning point. He called large psychiatric hospitals relics of the Victorian era that should be closed. Instead, community-based psychiatric services should be created. Patients should be treated in general hospitals or on an outpatient basis, rather than being isolated for years in special institutions. This speech began the process of deinstitutionalization. In the 1960s and 1970s, psychiatric hospitals began to close. Patients were discharged into the community, often without adequate preparation and support. It was assumed that community mental health services would be created to help them, but funding for these services was insufficient. Many discharged patients found themselves in a difficult position. They had lived most of their lives in institutions and did not have the skills for independent living. They had no families ready to accept them, no housing, and no work. Some became homeless, living on the streets of cities. Others ended up in prisons, where their mental health problems did not receive proper attention. The closure of hospitals accelerated in the 1980s and 1990s. The government saw an economic benefit. Maintaining large institutions was expensive, and their land and buildings could be sold to developers. Many Victorian asylums were demolished or converted into luxury apartments. The majestic buildings that were once symbols of social care for the mentally ill became real estate. By the beginning of the 21st century, almost nothing remained of the Victorian asylum system. The number of beds in psychiatric hospitals had dropped from 150,000 inches, the 1950s, to less than 30,000. This was one of the most radical changes in the British institutional landscape since the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. The history of Victorian psychiatric asylums ended, but its legacy continues to influence us. The idea that mental illness is a medical condition requiring treatment, not punishment, came from the Victorian era. The principle of respect for the dignity of patients, the rejection of physical restraint and cruelty, all this began at the York Retreat and Hanwell. But history also teaches us to be careful. Good intentions do not always lead to good results. The system created to help the mentally ill turned into a mechanism for their isolation. Institutions built as places of healing became warehouses for those whom society had abandoned. The modern system of community psychiatric care has its own problem: insufficient funding, a lack of housing and support for people with severe mental illnesses, and the stigmatization of the mentally ill continue to exist. Some critics argue that the closure of hospitals was a mistake, that society simply refused its responsibility for its most vulnerable citizens under the guise of progressive ideas. Nevertheless, few would want to return to the system of large Victorian asylum. History has shown their shortcomings too clearly: overcrowding, a lack of staff, cruelty, and the institutionalization of patients who lost the ability to live outside of institution. All this makes a return to the past impossible. Victorian psychiatric asylums were a product of their time. They reflected the 19th century belief in progress, in science, and in the possibility of solving social problems through the creation of specialized institutions. They also reflected the limitations of that time: insufficient medical knowledge, class prejudices, and gender stereotypes. Today, these buildings, if they are still standing, serve as a reminder of a complex history. Their majestic architecture speaks of the noble intentions of their founder. Their abandonment or conversion into residential complexes tells us how our understanding of mental illness and the ways to help those who suffer from it have changed. The history of Victorian psychiatric asylums lasted for more than a century, from the end of the 18th to the end of the 20th century. It was a story of hope and disappointment, reform and stagnation, humanity and cruelty. It was a story about society's attempt to deal with a problem it did not fully understand, using means that proved insufficient. Ultimately, Victorian asylums remind us that caring for people with mental illnesses is a constant duty of society, not a task that can be solved once and for all. Each generation must find new ways to help the most vulnerable, considering the mistakes of the past but not repeating them.